The faded baseball cap was pulled low, nearly hiding his weary eyes. A wrinkled flannel shirt covered his gaunt frame, and the left knee of his jeans was torn open, as if it had been dragged somewhere. The man sat alone in the far corner of the diner, a place no one wanted to notice, and just as expected, no one did. He struggled with the ice-cold cup of coffee, then fumbled and spilled it while searching his pockets for his wallet. Ironically, the wallet was gone. Maybe it had been pickpocketed on the cheap early morning bus. Maybe he had left it somewhere. But no one turned to look. No one asked. To everyone, he was just a lost man, poor, unimportant. Except for one person, a girl in her early 20s, her brown hair hastily tied back, her apron stained with grease and ketchup, her eyes tired but not closed to kindness. Even while juggling 3 tables, wiping the counter, and taking a takeaway order over the phone, she managed to turn back to refill his coffee, then paused when she saw his predicament. "It's okay," she said softly, pulling a few bills from her apron pocket. "It's just a sandwich. It looks like you need it more than I do today." His hand froze. His heart seemed to stop. It wasn't because of the money, but because of that sentence. The exact words, the intonation, the rhythm of her breath. That sentence. He had heard it before, from a woman, in this very diner, 27 years ago. Back then, a young Grant Holloway had watched his mother, Rosalind, give her last piece of pie to a homeless man, then lean in and whisper, "It's just a piece of pie. It looks like you need it more than I do today." And now, that sentence returned from the mouth of a strange girl to an old man no one bothered to look at. It wasn't a coincidence. It was destiny. But Grant hadn't come here for a sandwich. He hadn't come here to be pitied. He had come to find the truth about the empire his mother had built with her hands, her heart, and her compassion. An empire that had now lost something sacred that reports couldn't measure, and timesheets couldn't record. Rosalind's table, once a roadside diner, had become a chain of 67 branches stretching across the southeastern United States, famous for its hand-baked biscuits, crispy-skinned fried chicken soaked in sauce, and the philosophy to never let a guest leave with an empty stomach. But recently, Grant had begun to realize the slogan remained. The recipes were still correct, but the soul was gone, and now, in a worn-out old booth, with cold coffee and a quiet, returning faith, Grant knew it was time to come home. It had been years since Grant had returned to this place, the first branch, tucked away beside the highway that ran through the town of Clearwater. The red-lettered Rosalind's table sign still hung there, but it was faded, like the memories of those who once called this place home. The porch swings still swayed in the wind, letting out an old, creaking sound as if they were whispering something familiar. Nearly 3 decades ago, in the small kitchen behind this very building, his mother, Rosalind, had baked her first biscuit. No capital, no partners, no flashy sign. Just a recipe notebook, an ironclad belief in kindness, and a little boy who was always running around her feet with a look of admiration in his eyes. In those days, customers didn't come for the menu. They came for the feeling of belonging, of being remembered by name, of being asked after, of being cared for like family. Now, the company Grant had built from that legacy had become a multi-million-dollar brand. The executive office was on the 27th floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in the middle of downtown Atlanta. Everything was modern, polished, efficient, but the warmth was gone. The smell of freshly baked biscuits was gone. The joyful eyes of regular customers were gone. Everything was slowly becoming a process. A series of recent reports had left him unsettled. Customers rated the emotional experience poorly, even though the food was still good. Employees were quitting constantly. The customer return rate had dropped sharply, but those numbers only told part of the story. To truly know what had happened to Rosalind's table, he knew he had to do what high-level CEOs rarely do: go back. Quietly, without a name, without power, without any preparation. And so, Grant set out, carrying only a canvas bag, a few old sets of clothes, and a wallet that held nothing but a fake ID with the name Rick, an early retired homeless man who wanted to apply for a job at a family diner. He entered the diner with a weary posture, slumped shoulders, and slow steps, blending into the crowd like a grain of sand in a desert. No one recognized him. That was to be expected. He had appeared in financial newspapers, but no one here read those papers. He was a complete stranger to their daily lives, just as his company was becoming a stranger to his mother's name. The current manager, Shane Burke, didn't even bother to look up from his phone screen when he walked in. Shane's eyes held an indifference that had been honed into a skill, a survival skill in an industrial-style chain of operations where productivity was placed above empathy. Grant chose the booth by the window, the same one where his mother used to sit and write in her notebook after every shift. He sat there, observing, not speaking, not intervening, just listening and waiting for something he couldn't name, but would recognize when it appeared. And then it appeared, not in words, but in a glance, a nod, an action that was never requested. That girl moved through others' lives as gently as a breeze. No one noticed her, but anyone she touched felt their heart soften. Mira Sullivan. 22, had been working at the diner since she was 16, starting as a prep cook washing vegetables, then moving to waiting tables because they were short-staffed. Now, she was the first to arrive and often the last to leave her shift, not for the overtime pay, but because someone needs me to stay. Grant sat in the hidden corner of the diner, pretending to read the old menu, but was actually observing. He didn't see an outstanding employee in Mira. He saw something deeper, a person who was kind without needing an audience. That morning, an old man struggled to push the door open with his trembling cane. While the other employees continued to carry orders, Mira put down the tray she was holding, ran to open the door, caught the old man's hat as it fell, and gently asked, "Would you like to sit closer to the window or the heater, sir?" A moment later, a child began to wail at a nearby table. The young mother frantically asked for more napkins. Before the mother could turn back, Mira had reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a blue straw and quickly twisted it into a small dog with a deft puff of air. The child fell silent, then giggled. Mira just smiled and gently patted the mother's shoulder as if to say, "It's okay," when a man with a scruffy beard, dark-circled eyes, and the smell of motor oil still clinging to his sleeves asked, "Are you guys hiring?" Mira didn't scowl, didn't look away. She immediately pulled an application form from a drawer at the counter, placed a pen on top of it, and gave him a hopeful nod. "Just fill this out." "Do you know how to work the grill?" Grant watched it all. Every detail was like a mirror reflecting what had been lost in the system he had built. No one told Mira to do these things. No KPI recorded these actions. No bonus chart gave points for natural kindness. And then, when he dropped his wallet, or rather, when he realized it had been missing since the bus ride, Mira didn't laugh, didn't report him to the manager, and didn't walk away. She knelt down, her gaze lower than his, and said gently, "It's okay, sir. It looks like you need that sandwich more than I do today. No hesitation, no conditions, no need to know who he was." That sentence didn't just save him from a hungry afternoon. It was like a pair of scissors cutting through the thick fog that had shrouded his soul for so many years. All the reports, all the meetings, all the brand strategies were worth less than one sincere sentence. Grant could hardly breathe. His heart slowed as if he were hearing an echo from the past. 27 years ago, in this very booth, his mother, Rosalyn, had also leaned down, smiled, and said the very same thing to a starving man. "You look like you need this piece of pie more than I do. I'll be fine." How? How could Mira have known to say those exact words? Was it destiny? Or was it a reminder from his departed mother? He didn't know. But he was sure of one thing: this girl was not ordinary, not excellent by market definitions, but extraordinary in the small things. His heart stirred, not with surprise, but with hope. That evening, as the last rays of sun stretched across the cracked cement behind the diner, Grant stood silently in the parking lot, observing Mira from a distance, no longer a CEO, no longer the lost man playing the part of Rick, but a man trying to remember how to see the world with his heart. Mira sat alone on the curb, her back leaning against a metal dumpster. In one hand, she held a plastic food container. With the other, she flipped through a thick notebook labeled Nutrition and Family Development, Final Exam Review. The light from the kitchen's back lamp was just enough for Grant to see her mouthing the words, her lips moving as if she were lecturing to invisible students seated before her. Her eyes were on the page, but her mind seemed to be living in an unfinished dream. Mira was a student. That made Grant pause for a few seconds. In a place that revolved around deadlines, bonuses, and time clocks, this fragile girl was quietly studying to change her life. No one at the diner knew. No one asked. No one noticed. And then, as she turned a page, a small, stiff card slipped from her jacket pocket. Mira picked it up carefully, dusted it off, and placed it in the palm of her hand as if it were a sacred object. A handwritten card. On it was written, Mum's biscuit recipe, original. Don't forget the butter smile. The corners of the paper were worn from folding. The ink was faded with time, but the words were still clear. Beside them were a few notes in pencil, 350 to 15 mins. Add cinnamon if it's for someone sad. Grant froze. That recipe, that handwriting, that abbreviated style of writing. The way notes were added not to perfect the dish, but to heal. That was his mother's philosophy. It was the philosophy that had created Rosalind's table. He felt as if he had just seen a seed of the old soul sprouting again, vibrant and silent, in the hands of a girl his company had never known. That night, Grant went online and searched for Mira Sullivan on Instagram, a small account with only 187 followers. The photos were filled with cookies, banana bread, and animal-shaped pastries, but not for sale. Each picture was accompanied by a small message written in frosting. You matter. You're doing better than you think. Be sweet to someone today. Nearly every post ended with that phrase, be sweet to someone today. It wasn't a marketing slogan. It wasn't a media campaign. It wasn't to chase likes. It was just a reminder as gentle as the wind, but when read in the darkness of a lost CEO, it felt like a hug from a departed mother. Grant leaned his head softly against the wall, his hands hanging limp. This girl didn't just know how to bake. She was baking back to life the heart of the brand he had lost. The next morning, Grant returned, no longer hiding in the corner of the diner, no longer waiting for Mira to bring him a pastry or quietly taking pictures of the menu. This time, he walked through the door with a gentle smile, his old shirt tucked in, and in his hand was a resume printed from headquarters. The manager, Shane Burke, was standing by the counter, a coffee cup in one hand, the other hand performatively sliding pastry trays back and forth. When Grant held out his hand and said with a timid look, "Hi, I'm Rick. I was sent from the main office to help with a review of the kitchen operations." Shane laughed, a half-mocking, half-weary kind of laugh. "Ah, the guys from corporate. You always show up when a place is about to go under." Grant just smiled and nodded lightly. "Well, all the more reason for you to show me why we should keep it." He didn't reveal his identity. He wasn't in a rush. He needed to see every nook and cranny that the reports didn't capture. And so, Rick started from the lowest job in the system. He mopped the floors. He crouched down to scrub old, caked-on grease spots hidden under the kitchen counters. He peeled off labels. He reorganized the storeroom with an obsessive meticulousness, something no one there cared about, except for one person. Mira. She quietly helped him when she saw his hands trembling from carrying a box that was too heavy. She didn't ask about his background. She didn't doubt him. She just offered a hand at the exact moment it was needed. Grant noticed she always stepped in a beat before anyone thought to ask for help. That afternoon, he pretended to fix a wobbly table in the customer area. From his crouched position, he saw everything. A young employee used the excuse of a stomachache to go to the restroom for nearly 30 minutes. She was actually on FaceTime with her boyfriend, who covered her shift. Mira. A single mother came in to eat with her 3 small children. Her credit card was declined. Mira quickly went into the kitchen and secretly asked the head cook to make kids' sandwiches at cost. When the mother refused, Mira said, "Then, just for the little ones. Okay, you can just call your part of the bill a serving of kindness." Grant bit his lip. He had once built an entire training manual around a culture of hospitality. But for how long had that culture been stifled by KPIs and star ratings? And then, in the afternoon, Mira was scolded by Shane again for what she had dared to replace the syrup on a pancake with a little heart-shaped dollop of whipped cream, just because a little boy was crying for a birthday cake even though it wasn't his real birthday. "Do you think this is a daycare?" Shane growled. "Syrup is easier. Cream takes time. Besides, no one is paying extra for these little games." Mira lowered her head. She didn't argue. She didn't react. She just said softly, "I thought the little boy needed to feel a little special." That sentence made Grant stop. He remembered. His mother had also used cream to write the word hope on the cake of a woman who had lost her job, even though no one had asked, even though, back then, they were still losing money. Kindness. It wasn't a strategy. It was an instinct, and Mira was the resurrection of that instinct. As the afternoon wore on, Mira secretly blew up a balloon from a straw and gave it to a little girl waiting for her mother to get the car. Shane scoffed, shook his head, and pulled out his phone to report an unfocused employee. And Grant, still Rick, just quietly took note, not in a notebook, but in his heart. That night, rain pattered on the tin roof of the roadside motel where Grant had rented a room, cheap, cramped, and with no minibar like he was used to. He sat on the bed, his flannel shirt draped over a chair, his shoes still covered in flour and cooking oil, his eyes staring blankly at the dull white ceiling, where a crack stretched like an unhealed vein. His phone was in his hand. The screen was empty. No meeting notifications, no messages from the board, no financial reports. For the first time in years, he wasn't surrounded by his schedule, but by a hollow feeling he couldn't name. He had seen Mira do things no other employee did. He had seen Shane react to kindness as if it were a procedural error. He had seen his mother again, not as an image, but through the small gestures, words, and actions of a girl who didn't even know who she was. Kindness pays in ways dollars don't. The saying echoed in his head like an old but vivid whisper. It was what his mother used to say when she'd write down someone's meal on credit in the ledger behind the counter, even knowing they might never come back. Grant lowered his head, resting his forehead in his hands. The company he had built from his mother's hands, a place for people to feel like they belonged, for employees to be trusted instead of monitored, had now become a cold machine, where every act of kindness was seen as inefficient. And then he asked himself, why was a girl like Mira, who lit up the entire diner's atmosphere, not recognized at all? Why did her kindness get her scolded? While indifferent people like Shane were kept in management positions, there was no answer, only the feeling that he was part of the problem. He had let his company drift too far from its roots. He had let culture become a bullet point on a slide, instead of something that lived and breathed and could be felt. And it was he, the man on the 27th floor, who had forgotten what it felt like to have someone refill his coffee for no reason at all. That night, Grant didn't sleep. He opened Mira's Instagram page again. He looked at every cookie she had baked. He read every scrawled word on the frosting. You're loved. Don't give up yet. Sweetness isn't weakness. There was a post from 4 months ago with only 12 likes. A picture of the old card with the faded words, Mom's Biscuit Recipe. The caption was simple. She gave away the last one. And today, I'm still doing the same. Grant burst into tears, not for Mira, but because he had forgotten the mother who had given away her last piece of pie to create this empire. Tomorrow morning, he would go back, not as Rick, not as a customer, but as Grant Holloway, CEO of Rosalind's Table. And when he returned, the sandwich Mira had unconditionally given him the day before would be the very sandwich that changed her life. The sky had not yet fully brightened when the black pickup truck stopped behind the delivery area of the Clearwater branch of Rosalind's Table. No more baseball cap, no more old flannel shirt or empty wallet. Today, Grant wore a simple navy jacket, dress pants, and soft leather shoes, not to appear luxurious, but to step into the role that rightfully belonged to him. He went straight through the kitchen door, not the front door for customers, but the door his mother used to walk through every morning, carrying a bag of flour and a heart full of love. The head cook looked up, blinked for a moment, then gave a curt greeting. Shane, who was checking an order, furrowed his brow. Who are you?" Grant looked him straight in the eye, his voice calm. "I'm Grant Holloway. I founded Rosalind's Table. And today, I want to see everyone, now, at table number 4. Not a single reply. Only a silence as thick as when the power goes out. But the authority in his voice allowed no refusal. 10 minutes later, the entire staff, from the cooks, dishwashers, and waiters to the night security guard, stood huddled around the square table number 4. A few looked at him, then at each other. A flicker of recognition in their eyes. Others were anxious. Shane's face was red, his hands stuffed in his pockets as if he were plotting an escape route. Mira stood on the outer edge of the group, her apron still stained with a smear of butter, a coffee pot still in her hand, not yet set down. She looked at him as if trying to piece together the man in front of her with the face of Rick from the past few days. Grant took a deep breath. "My name is Grant Holloway," he began, his voice just loud enough to be heard but full of force. "Some of you might know me, most of you probably don't. But if you've ever heard the name Rosalind, she was my mother. And this room, this very place, is where it all began." Looks of surprise began to spread. A whisper came from the back. "Is he really the CEO?" Grant's eyes scanned the room, his gaze resting slowly on each face, not missing anyone. "I didn't come back here to inspect, not to supervise. I came back to remember the smell of biscuit dough in the morning, to remember how my mother knew every customer by name, to remember the board behind the counter where she would write down the meals of those who couldn't pay and still smile when they never came back. He paused for a moment, his gaze growing heavy. But what I've seen these past few days has, in part, broken my heart. I saw indifference, apathy, disrespect for customers, and even disrespect for each other. No one dared to breathe loudly. Shane stared at the floor. And then Grant turned to face Mira. But I also saw hope. Mira froze. The coffee pot trembled slightly in her hand. I saw someone who wasn't given a leadership role, but who led with her heart. I saw someone willing to lose her break, willing to be scolded, willing to pay out of her own pocket just to keep someone else's day a little kinder. I saw my mother brought back to life in her every small action. He took a step forward, his voice dropping lower. Mira. Her name rang out like a lightning strike in the still, dim morning. Mira stared at him, her eyes beginning to well up with tears. That day, when I had no money to pay for the sandwich, you said, "It looks like you need it more than I do." Those words were the exact words my mother once said, from this very place, 27 years ago. The room fell quiet. No one spoke. Only the sound of Mira's ragged breathing could be heard. "How did you know that phrase?" he asked gently. Mira's voice was choked with emotion. "My mother was also helped by Mrs. Roslin once. I grew up with stories of her kindness. I just repeated what I believed was right." Grant nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a sealed white envelope and a simple gold pin. "I have 2 gifts." He placed the envelope in Mira's hand. A full scholarship for nutrition and family development at the University of Georgia. A collective gasp went through the room. Mira nearly buckled. Someone from behind had to reach out and steady her elbow. "And the second gift," Grant said, pinning the pin to her apron, "Operations Lead, Eastern Region. I want you to lead the new generations, not with manuals, but with the very way you live." Mira let out a soft sob. "But I'm just a waitress." Grant smiled. "That's precisely why you're perfect. True leaders lead with compassion first. The skills will follow." And in that moment, as applause, choked sobs, and sighs of relief filled the air, Grant knew it wasn't just Mira who had been changed. This whole room, this whole company, and perhaps he, too, had just been saved. In all his years of running the company, Grant Holloway had presented hundreds of awards, signed thousands of appointment letters, and spoken countless times at service industry leadership conferences, but never, not once, had he felt he was speaking to the right person as he did this morning. The room seemed quieter than the dawn outside the glass door. Mira stood motionless, her hands not yet having tightened around the envelope, her eyes filled with layers of nameless emotions, astonishment, gratitude, fear, and a small part that couldn't dare to believe this was happening. Grant continued, speaking gently, his voice no longer that of a CEO, but of a father. "I know you don't think you're ready. You think you're just a waitress." "Right." Mira nodded slightly. "But I think differently. I think when you dared to give away the little you had to someone you thought was a nobody, you were already more ready than many people who have stood in a boardroom with me." A small smatter of applause started from a corner of the room. It was the skinny prep cook, the one Shane often yelled at. Then it spread like a wave breaking through a dam. The head cook, the night guard, the dishwasher, they all began to clap, not out of ceremony, but because they saw a piece of themselves in Mira. Mira turned to Grant, her hands still trembling. "Why?" "Me," Grant answered without a thought. "Because you were kind, even when you thought no one was watching." Those words struck a chord in the heart of everyone in the room. Shane's gaze dropped to the floor. His face, so long the face of a controller, an order giver, a dispenser of shifts, now seemed small, lost and trembling. He stammered, I didn't know she had that kind of potential. Really, if I had known, I would have." Grant raised a hand, cutting him off with a gesture that was soft yet final. "We'll talk later." Shane. That sentence, in the language of executives, meant pack your things. It wasn't because he had made one big mistake. It was because he was too small for an organization that needed to grow from the inside. Grant turned back to Mira. "You're not just receiving a scholarship. You're not just receiving a position. You are becoming the new face of Rosalind's table." He pulled out his phone, raising it as if to take a picture, but then paused, handing it to a young waiter standing nearby. "Take a picture of Mira and me, under that sign." The entire room moved to the front door. For the first time since the diner opened, all the employees stood together for a photo. Not for a birthday, not for a grand opening, but for an act of kindness. Under the faded red-painted sign that read, "Rosalind's Table." Since 1997, Mira stood next to Grant. Her apron was still old. Her hands still had flour on them. But her back was straighter. Her gaze was no longer downcast. She smiled. Grant smiled too. A moment of stillness, as if the whole world had paused to take a breath. The picture was posted to the diner's Instagram page that afternoon, with a simple caption, "This waitress paid for a stranger's sandwich. She didn't know he was the CEO. Today, he changed her life. But truly, she changed ours." Within 24 hours of the photo taken under the Rosalind's Table since 1997 sign being posted, everything began to change, not through a press release, not through a loud media campaign, but through small stories that were spread, whispered, and shared. The diner's post, with just a few lines of text and a photo of the CEO embracing Mira, quickly went viral on social media. A customer who had once eaten at the Atlanta branch commented, "I once saw that girl give extra biscuits to a sick child. I only just learned her name is Mira." A truck driver reposted the photo with the caption, "She once brought coffee out to the parking lot for me while I was waiting to make a delivery in the rain. No one asked her to. She just said, You must be cold. Each small, isolated act, each quiet gesture of kindness, was suddenly pieced together into a clear portrait not of Mira, but of the soul the company had once lost. And from there, the unexpected began to happen. At the Macon, Georgia branch, a shy dishwasher started leaving handwritten notes saying, "Thank you for visiting," for every Uber Eats driver. At the Birmingham, Alabama branch, the head cook used his own money to buy the ingredients for the old Mom's Biscuits recipe and wrote Mira's name on the specials board, the inspired biscuit, Mira's Way. In South Carolina, a manager who had been criticized for being too robotic sent an email to his entire staff with the subject line, "We forgot why we started. It's time to remember." No one gave an order. No one forced it. There was only the power of one story, authentic, kind, and full of emotion. Grant Holloway sat in the corporate headquarters, but this time not on the 27th floor. He chose a small room on the ground floor where customers used to send feedback letters, and he read every line of feedback as if it were a handwritten letter from long ago. A low-level employee wrote, "I used to think I had no value in this system. After Mira's story, I've started saying thank you first, without waiting for the customer to." A long-time manager requested to step down from his executive role to become a mentor to truly train the Rosalind culture for newly opened branches. The awakening happened without a drumbeat. It came like the scent of warm biscuits on a rainy morning. Silent, warm, but felt by everyone. The next morning, Mira arrived at her old branch earlier than usual, as was her habit. But this time, it wasn't to arrange cutlery or wipe tables. On the counter was a small box, with a sticky note on it, "Mira, open when you're ready." She lifted the lid. Inside was an old, yellowed recipe card. The ink almost completely faded, but the title at the top was still legible, "Mama's Biscuits." The original. Taped to the top right corner of the card was a small, handwritten piece of paper. There was no sender's name, only the simple words, "You've baked them already. Now, bake them your way." Mira looked at the words, speechless. Her hands tightened around the recipe card, not to hold it tight, but as if to touch a timeless legacy. She didn't need anyone to tell her. She knew what she would do next. The narrator's voice rose gently, like a fine morning mist. Sometimes, a life isn't changed by a report, a meeting, or a handshake between people in suits, but by a sandwich with no bill, a sentence no one else heard, a pair of eyes that knew how to listen when no one else bothered to look. That afternoon, Mira stood by the window of the branch, her hand gently rubbing a spot of flour on her new apron, not the old uniform, but the regional operations manager's jacket, her name embroidered in silver thread. Mira still smiled, still bent down to look into the eyes of every child, still leaned her ear very close when an elderly customer couldn't hear what she was saying. But one thing had changed forever when she walked past the kitchen. People looked up. When she nodded, people felt seen. When she said thank you, it was no longer just a courtesy, but a blessing. At all the other branches, people started asking each other a simple question. Are you being a mirror? When no one is watching. No answer was needed, only action. A piece of biscuit shared with a late delivery driver. A bottle of water brought out to a man pushing a stroller under the hot sun. A handwritten note clipped to a takeout box. I know you've had a tough day. I hope this meal makes it a little better. No cameras, no hashtags, no one jumping on a trend. Only the return of the most sacred thing the company had ever owned, then lost, then found again: kindness, without the need for recognition. In the ground floor archives at Rosalind's table headquarters, a new picture frame was placed on a wooden shelf. In the photo was a departed woman, Rosalind, and a faded recipe card, laminated and placed next to a caption, Mama's Biscuits, passed down, paid forward. Right below it was a new note, in slanted handwriting, never underestimate a biscuit. It might be the only thing that person receives all day. And sometimes it can even save a CEO. If this story made you smile, let it live on through you. You don't have to bake a biscuit, just bake your own heart for someone today, because kindness never expires.